So today I want to share with you a story that my mom told me last night. It's important to note that my mom is deaf, and this story absolutely blew me away. She had an experience with an officer who pulled her over. So last night she was driving on a road that she knows very well. She was going about 29 miles per hour in a 25. Not that fast. She was with my grandma at the time, who was 92. She was sitting in the passenger seat. My mom's husband was in the back seat. So she's driving along, and up ahead she notices a cop on a motorcycle. She didn't really think anything of it. She kept driving along at the same pace. Didn't bother to slow down or anything, when all of a sudden the cop pulls in behind her. Again, she doesn't really think anything of it at first. She figures it's not for her because she's not driving that fast. She moves over to let the cop pass, but the cop puts his lights on, and gets behind her, even as she changes lanes. At this point, she finally realizes that the cop may be trying to pull her over. So she pulls to the side of the road, the cop gets out, and my mom rolls down the window. And then at this point, the cop begins to talk at her. Of course, she can't understand what he's saying. She tries to communicate that she signs, but he continues to talk at her. So she turns to her husband and begins to sign. And at this point, the cop finally realizes that she's deaf. When she looks back at him, the cop then mouths to her slowly, "Can you read my lips?" And of course she can't, because that's very difficult and she doesn't possess that skill. At this point, she requests an interpreter or to write back and forth, but the cop does not make any effort to actually communicate and instead keeps talking at her. He demands to see her license, and at this point she also isn't really clear on the reason why he has pulled her over, since she really wasn't speeding that badly. And again, the cop is not communicating clearly, not writing back and forth, or providing any other alternative methods. So she gives her license to the cop, and he comes back with a ticket. Now, the writing on this ticket is very small and difficult to read, and my mother can't make out the fine print on the ticket. She's trying to communicate that she's not able to read the ticket, but the cop is insisting that, according to Nevada law, she has to sign it right away. However, the law also states that you're supposed to have time to read it and decide if you want to plead guilty to the charges. But the cop was insisting that she had to sign it right away, even though she didn't understand the reason why she was being pulled over. So the cop insisted that she sign the ticket immediately. My mother, at this point, tried to demand an interpreter, but she and the cop are still arguing back and forth. The cop, in fact, actually refused to provide her an interpreter. It's really interesting because Spanish-speaking people are required by the law to be provided an interpreter immediately upon being ticketed. So the communication is basically non-existent at this point. The cop says that if she has a problem with it, she can take it to court. And my mom says, "Well, what if I don't sign this ticket?" And the cop says, "Well, then you're going to go to jail." And my mom is thinking, okay, you're going to send me to jail? Well, you can go ahead and drive my grandma and my sick husband back home then, if you want to, and I'll go to jail, that's fine. So they're continuing to argue back and forth about this ticket. And in the back of her mind, my mom is thinking, fine, I'm just going to write something down. She considered writing a fake name just to get the cop off her back. But I advised her that what she should really do is write that because the cop didn't make any effort to communicate, she should write on that line that she didn't understand the reason why she was being ticketed. That way, she would still have some power over the situation. So after this ordeal, we actually got in touch with a friend of mine who is a cop who is hearing and studying to become an interpreter, and asked for his advice on what we should do. He advised us to go to the Department of Internal Affairs and file a complaint. So that's what my mother did. She went in, she filed a complaint, and they were actually very supportive of her. They told her that she would be provided a lawyer and an interpreter for her court date to interpret this ticket for her, which was great. So the ADA law, when it comes to individual states, is a little bit hazy sometimes. Individual states are allowed to establish if interpreter is required to be present when someone is being ticketed. Again, remember that this cop didn't make any effort to communicate why she was actually being pulled over, and didn't provide any method of communication to help my mother understand the situation. So because that law is hazy, I think that would be a good discussion at some point, talking about the ADA law and how it could be difficult to understand. So my mother took another look at this ticket and all of the fine print, and she realized that the cost for this was $300. I mean, for what? It said that she was speeding in a construction zone, but there wasn't any equipment, there were no workers around to indicate that it was a construction zone, like the ticket said. So the ticket really wasn't truthful. So my mother's going to go ahead and proceed with her court date, and I will update you when the court date has been, or when the court trial has been finished. So this is part 2 to my story about my deaf mother and her experience with the cop and the law. So to recap what's happened so far, my mother was pulled over by an officer. This officer spoke at her and did not make any effort to communicate, even upon realizing that she was deaf. There was no writing back and forth, and the communication was a huge struggle. An interpreter was also not provided. My mother felt that this ticket wasn't true, so she decided to go to court. She had to wait for a bit, but finally in August, the court date arrived and she went to trial. So at the time of the trial, she entered the courtroom and showed her ticket to a bailiff. She was ready to go and ready to proceed. They told her that the lawyer and the interpreter would both meet her inside of the courtroom. So she sat down on the benches and sort of people watched, watching all of the different people in different cases go by. The crowd began to get smaller and smaller as time passed, and she was wondering where her interpreter was. She actually noticed something interesting, which was an interpreter for a Chinese immigrant. She thought it was interesting how readily available interpreters were for immigrants, even someone who spoke a language like Chinese, and she was wondering where her interpreter was. The crowd began to dwindle more and more, and so she decided to get up and go ask the bailiff where her interpreter was. But the bailiff more or less told her to just sit down and wait. The crowd got smaller and smaller until finally she was the only person left in the entire room. Her lawyer was staring at her, the bailiff was staring at her. They approached her to try and ask, where her interpreter was or to start the court date, but the interpreter had not shown up. So at this point, the bailiff leans in and speaks into his little microphone, and they actually bring over a cop who was proficient in sign language, and he was going to help facilitate the communication and act as the interpreter. But my mother requested a sign language interpreter, and that's not what the cop was. The cop, being a cop, would have a huge conflict of interest in his role. But the court proceeded anyway because the interpreter was not present. So they reviewed the ticket, and my mother explained that she felt that $300 was very costly for only going 4 miles over the speed limit. So they continued to review the ticket, and they got the cost down to about $150. Now, would you accept something like that? No way. To me, that's ridiculous. Especially since that cop didn't make any effort to communicate or even tell my mom what the problem was. He didn't provide an interpreter, as is required by Nevada state law. And then they also didn't even provide her an interpreter in court. They told her that it would cost $500 out of her own pocket to have an interpreter for a ticket over 4 miles an hour. So they got it reduced down again to about $100, but at this point her lawyer told her that to push it any further would be sort of a risk. My mother wanted to continue to fight it to get it dismissed altogether, but again, The lawyer advised her not to. He said that the judge that day may actually increase the fees on the $300 ticket. It could be dismissed, but it could be even worse. By the way, this happened in the Las Vegas Clark County court. So my mother doesn't have an interpreter at this point, a legitimate qualified interpreter. She'd have to pay out of pocket for one. The court is very unsupportive of her at this point. And the person they provided as the interpreter has a conflict of interest in his role. She felt so ganged up by everyone in the situation. And as much as she wanted to come back and try to get it dismissed, it was just very overwhelming. And really, in the back of her mind, she's just thinking about how much she wants to just get out of here and away from this situation. So she decided to go ahead and pay the ticket. And really, the cost of the ticket is not the point of this story, but rather how we need to improve the system of interpreters for deaf people. Immigrants are readily provided interpreters, no matter what, but deaf Americans take a lower priority. That's just not right. So I encouraged my mother that that she should follow up on this and really make sure she's following the Nevada state law when it comes to interpreters so that they can improve the system and so that other deaf people in the future will be given equal access. Thank you.